April 4, 1944, Kohima Ridge, Naga Hills, northeast India. The air hung thin at 5,000 feet, and the monsoon season had not yet arrived to soften the red earth. Morning broke pale and cold over the terraced hillsides, and with it came the sound of digging, not the rhythmic clang of agricultural labor, but the hurried scrape of entrenching tools against shale and clay. British and Indian soldiers carved shallow foxholes into the slopes surrounding a small administrative outpost that no one in London or Delhi had thought to memorialize. The ridge itself was narrow, barely wider than a cricket pitch in places, lined with bungalows and tennis courts belonging to the Deputy Commissioner's residence. Magnolia trees stood in bloom, incongruous against the backdrop of war. Below, in the valleys choked with rhododendron and bamboo, the Imperial Japanese Army was moving upward through the jungle, their boots silent on the jungle floor, their supply lines already stretched beyond doctrine. Kohima was not supposed to matter. It was a garrison town, or administrative dot on the maps used by planners in New Delhi and Calcutta, notable only for its position along the road linking Dimapur, the principal railhead and supply depot for the entire northeastern frontier, to the Imphal plain. But in the spring of 1944, Kohima became the hinge upon which the entire Burma campaign would turn. The Japanese offensive, codenamed Yugo, was designed to preempt a British counter-offensive into Burma, to sever the supply line to China, and perhaps, in the minds of its architects, to ignite a rebellion across India that would collapse the Raj from within. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commanding the 15th Army, had staked his reputation and the lives of 85,000 men on a plan that required speed, surprise, and the seizure of British supply depots before his own logistics collapsed. His divisions were expected to live off captured stores. They carried rations for 3 weeks. The operation was projected to last 3 months. The soldiers of the 31st Division, moving through the Naga Hills toward Kohima, had been told they were the vanguard of liberation. They had fought in China, in Malaya, in Burma. They had seen the British retreat at Singapore, watched the Americans falter at Bataan. They carried with them the conviction that willpower could substitute for logistics, that the jungle itself would provide, and that the enemy would break as he had broken before. Their officers spoke of the road to Delhi. In their packs they carried rice, dried fish, and the weight of an empire's ambition. What they did not carry was adequate ammunition resupply, medical supplies, or any contingency for prolonged resistance. They had been trained to expect collapse, not calcification. By April 6, the Japanese 138th Regiment had encircled Kohima entirely. The British garrison, fewer than 1,500 men, composed of the 4th Battalion Royal West Kent Regiment, Assam Rifles, and non-combatant personnel hastily armed, was cut off. The perimeter shrank daily. Soldiers defended the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow, the tennis court, the hospital spur, and Garrison Hill with a ferocity born of geographic fatalism. There was nowhere to retreat. Water became scarce. Wounded men lay in open trenches as mortar shells burst overhead, sending shrapnel through the magnolia branches. The Japanese attacked at night, their formations disciplined and relentless, pushing through barbed wire and machine gun fire to within grenade range. They dug tunnels beneath British positions. They fought for individual bungalows, room by room. And yet the line held, not through brilliance or technological advantage, but through exhaustion equally shared and a brutal arithmetic of attrition. What the Japanese soldiers encountered at Kohima was not retreat, but reinforcement. On April 15, the British 2nd Division, moving up from Dimapur, began to break through the encirclement. Artillery, mass batteries of 25-pounders and 3.7-inch howitzers, began to shell the Japanese positions with a volume of fire that no amount of Bushido could answer. The soldiers of the 15th Army had expected scarcity on the British side, disorganization, the familiar pattern of imperial withdrawal. Instead, they found themselves subjected to an industrial siege. Shells arrived not in dozens, but in thousands. Air supply drops descended onto British positions with metronomic regularity, crates of ammunition, tins of beef and biscuits, medical supplies, replacement uniforms. The contrast was absolute. Japanese soldiers, already malnourished Their own supply columns had been cut to pieces by air interdiction and ambush. Mutaguchi's assurances that they would feast on captured British rations had evaporated into starvation. Archival records from captured Japanese diaries and post-war interrogations reveal a profound cognitive dissonance. Soldiers accustomed to viewing their enemy as soft, dependent on luxury, morally decadent, found themselves facing men who fought with the same desperate tenacity they had been taught to claim as uniquely Japanese. The British and Indian defenders did not break. They did not offer terms. They simply held ground, yard by yard, through weeks of close-quarter savagery. Japanese operational reports from mid-April note unexpected resistance, enemy reinforcement in greater strength than anticipated, and acute shortage of ammunition and rations. By late April, the attacking force had effectively transitioned from offensive to siege to slow starvation. Soldiers began to die not from British bullets, but from malnutrition, dysentery, and tropical disease. Medical officers recorded cases of men collapsing mid-attack, too weak to hold their rifles. The tennis court at Kohima became a symbol, not by design, but by consequence. It was a flat rectangle of earth, roughly 75 feet wide, around which the entire battle compressed. The British held one end, the Japanese the other. The distance between the two trench lines was often less than the length of a cricket pitch. Grenades were thrown back and forth. Snipers operated at point-blank range. The court itself became no man's land, its surface churned into mud and cordite, littered with the debris of empire, smashed tennis nets, fragments of colonial furniture, spent brass casings by the thousand. It was here, on this absurdly small patch of ground, that the tennis court did not decide the battle through tactics or heroism, but through its sheer refusal to yield, a stubbornness mirrored in the men who fought over it. Throughout May, as the monsoon rains began, the Japanese position became untenable. The road to Dimapur remained closed. The offensive toward Imphal had stalled. Mutaguchi, isolated from reality by his own command structure, continued to demand attacks. Division commanders, seeing their regiments disintegrate, complied out of duty or fear. The result was a slow hemorrhage of men and morale. Soldiers who had once believed in the invincibility of their cause now fought only to survive the next day. Letters retrieved from Japanese dead during the later British counteroffensive speak not of glory or mission, but of hunger, of comrades left unburied, of nights spent listening to the sound of British supply planes overhead, an unceasing reminder of the disparity they could not overcome. By early June, the British had fully broken the siege and begun pushing the Japanese back toward Burma. The retreat became a rout. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died not in combat, but on the jungle trails leading east, their bodies left to rot where they fell. Mutaguchi's 15th Army, which had begun the campaign with 85,000 men, suffered over 53,000 casualties. Kohima and Imphal together represented the largest defeat the Japanese army had suffered on land up to that point in the war. The road to India was closed. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already cracked at Midway and Guadalcanal, was shattered on the hills of Nagaland. The perception shift among Japanese officers was profound. Post-war memoirs and interrogation transcripts reveal a recurring theme, the realization that the enemy possessed not just material superiority, but organization. The British soldier, derided as effete and unwilling to sacrifice, had stood his ground under conditions that would have broken lesser formations. The Indian soldier, dismissed as a colonial proxy with no stake in the fight, had fought with discipline and courage. The Americans, unseen but omnipresent through Lend-Lease supplies and air support, had provided the steel framework upon which British operations rested. The Japanese command had built its strategy on the assumption of psychological fragility. Kohima proved that assumption catastrophic. Throughout the battle, one element recurred with quiet insistence, the tin can. British soldiers at Kohima ate from tins, bully beef, biscuits, tea, condensed milk, supplied in quantities that seemed infinite to their starving Japanese counterparts. These tins, stamped with factory codes from Birmingham, Chicago, Melbourne, accumulated in British trenches, their labels worn but legible. After firefights, Japanese patrols would sometimes retrieve them, not as trophies, but as evidence of an industrial capacity they could not match. The tin can, mundane and mass-produced, became an inadvertent symbol of the war's material imbalance. It required factories, supply chains, merchant fleets, and rail networks spanning continents. It required a kind of war the Japanese Empire, for all its warrior ethos, could not wage. The battle for Kohima ended not with a grand gesture, but with a slow, grinding restoration of control. The tennis court was cleared. The bungalows were retaken. The dead were buried in a cemetery that would later become one of the most visited Commonwealth War Graves Commission sites in Asia. The epitaph chosen for the memorial stone, borrowed from classical literature, reads simply, "The words were intended to honor British and Indian dead, but they apply equally to the Japanese soldiers who perished in the jungle, abandoned by a strategy that valued ideology over logistics, will over supply." Kohima did not end the war, but it marked a turning point in the psychology of the Burma campaign. The Japanese army, once seen as an unstoppable force, had been stopped not by genius or fortune, but by the patient application of resources, the discipline of men who refused to break, and the slow, inexorable weight of industrial democracy. The battle was forgotten for decades, overshadowed by D-Day and the liberation of Europe, remembered primarily by those who fought there and the Naga villagers who witnessed the destruction of their homeland. But in the narrow compass of that ridge, beneath the magnolia trees and the monsoon clouds, truth was written in mud and blood, that endurance, when backed by the machinery of free societies, could outlast even the most fervent belief in victory through spirit alone. The soldiers who held Kohima did not know they were making history. They knew only the weight of the rifle, the taste of tinned beef, and the grim mathematics of another day survived.